Good afternoon, guys. I hope everyone's having a good time. I promise you guys will get to have drinks soon. So I'm here today to talk to you about Codugh, the API marketplace where developers earn Bitcoin. Now, Codugh is an API marketplace where people pay per call or for execution time for each call that they make to an API. Now, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our progress since Sol. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our goals for the future and our vision for a more holistic ecosystem for developers. Now, for those of you who don't know what an API is essentially an interface that allows a program to share part of its functionality with other programs. So it's a simple way for people to not have to build certain functionalities into their application to still benefit from them. So my name's Shashank Singhal. I'm one of the co-founders of Codugh. And a bit about my background, I've worked as both a product manager and as a developer. I got into Bitcoin around 2016, but I didn't really build anything on it until early 2019, after the birth of BSV. This is because the use cases of BSV, microtransactions, fast confirmations, and near infinite scale, gave me a lot of ideas on how to build good businesses. So let me give you a bit of a reminder on what Codugh is and how it works. So first, I want to address the core problem in the developer community that Codugh deals with. So the first problem is that the API consumption experience is complex and time-consuming. So as an application developer, you often will have to subscribe to paid monthly APIs. What that means is you're paying a subscription every month. So if you're trying to integrate 3 or 4 APIs into your application, then suddenly you're in a mess because you have to call each a certain amount of time before you're actually getting enough money to pay for that subscription. And if something goes wrong when you're experimenting with your API, then suddenly you've lost money for no real reason. There are plenty of open source tools available, but many of them are poorly maintained because the developers are not incentivized to maintain them and keep them running. Also, many of these open source APIs have no SLAs or formal agreements. What this basically means is that as an application developer, you can't really fully trust an application when you're putting an API on it, when you're building your application on top of that API, because there's no way to assure that it will be up in the long term. So these problems make it really hard to build a scalable and reliable product on APIs. Now, the other side of the coin, and the second problem, is there's no simple solution for developers to monetize their APIs. Now, what this means is the amount of open source tools that exist is nothing compared to the amount of open source tools that we've lost over the years because people haven't had enough funding or time to build them. Right? So imagine a world where everyone in the third world, the first world, everywhere, could profit from the code that they build and could really be incentivized to help the developers around the world build their ecosystem. Right? And because of this, it's really hard, because of this problem, it's really hard to, in today's age, have developers incentivized to build a holistic ecosystem where they help each other. So what do we need? How can we solve this problem? Well, what we need is incentive and compensation without sacrificing accessibility. So what this means is that developers, API developers, are incentivized and compensated for their work when they help developers perform functions and contribute to the developer ecosystem. But this cannot come at the cost of application developers having a big barrier of entry that they can't surpass. Because then suddenly we have plenty of tools, but not many people who are allowed to use them. And if we can solve this problem, then we should have more tools, higher quality tools, and more reliable tools that people can build upon and build more reliable applications upon. And think about the application of this not only in the developed world, but also in the developing world, right? There are so many developers without economic opportunity around the world, and so much intellectual capital that we're not harnessing. If every developer around the world could just turn on the computer, code something up that can benefit people around the world, suddenly there's so much use case. There's so much power that we have as a developer community around the world. So to solve this problem, we built Codugh. Codugh, as I mentioned before, is an API marketplace that makes it easy for people to integrate a BSV-powered authentication system into that platform. So they don't have to worry about user management, they don't have to worry about authentication, they don't have to worry about pricing or billing. They just have to code and say, I want this much money per call for my API. And then developers around the world can come, use the API, and pay a small amount each time to benefit. So how does this solve the problem that we just talked about? Well, it solves the problem through experimentation. So application developers can play around with code at a cheap, negligible cost per call, and there's no commitment there. It solves the problem through reliability. Because these developers are incentivized not only through compensation, but also through competition, as it's a competitive marketplace, we're inspired to build products that help everyone and are reliable in the long term. It solves the problem through flexibility. With no monthly commitment, that's infinite flexibility for an application developer to pay as much as they use. And the API developer is profiting instantly from that usage. And it solves the problem through low cost. The cost doesn't become anything more than negligible until you're calling it hundreds, thousands of times. And by then, you should already have an application running and a user base that's giving you your own form of profit to front that cost. So what have we done since Sol? We've launched our waitlist. We're doing this to grow the necessary capacity to launch a marketplace, as you can't launch a marketplace with 10 developers. This has also allowed us to engage with a lot of developers around the world, and we've gotten a lot of ideas which have helped us build a product offering. So thanks to this field work and thanks to this waitlist, we engage with thousands of developers globally. And because of this, we received invaluable feedback, and we were able to tweak and perfect our product. And we'll talk a bit about more of that in the next couple of slides. We did this by taking a product first and BSV second approach. The first thing we pitched to non-BSV developers is our product. What value can we give them? Well, we can give them the values I just discussed. We can give them monetized APIs, and we can give them applications that can benefit from better tools globally. When they ask, how is this possible? How can you use microtransactions? How do you make that function on a large scale? Then we explain, hey, we use BSV. And we do that because of the fast confirmations, because of the near infinite scale, and because of the capability of microtransactions through low fees. And that has, again, allowed us to not only drive traffic to our own product, but also to the BSV ecosystem. So let's talk about some of the feedback we've gotten and how we've used it to better our product. Reliability is a big problem people had with the concept. How can I, as an application developer, trust a random API on the market, right? Because if I build my application on top of it and the API goes down, what then? My application goes down. Yes, it saves you development time, but it also creates another point of failure. So how are we addressing this? Now, there's a Node.js developer here who also had a problem with the quality of the APIs, right? How do I know that it's a quality API that I'm using? So what we did to fix these problems is we're implementing a ratings and review system. One thing that allows is application developers who've called APIs can then rate the APIs and review them to provide a more human element so people understand exactly how the API works, what its drawbacks might be. We're implementing badges. What badges are much more broad in a sense, because you can get a badge for a lot of things. You can get a badge for having a low latency API, because that speaks to the quality of your API. You can get a badge for having a high success rate on your calls. If your calls never fail, you can get a badge for that, because then people know, again, that you have a high quality and reliable API. If you have an SLA with a big company, you can get an API. You can get a badge, because again, that means that you have a commitment to someone to keep your product up, and that can make it more reliable for everyone else. And there are several other things, such as if you have serverless APIs, or you have a profitable API, because that means that you're incentivized through profit to keep your API running. Finally, we're implementing backup API rotation. So when there are two similar APIs on our platform, you can sponsor one as your primary API and one as your secondary API. The idea being if your primary API were to go down, your secondary API would kick in. And you can, in your own application, set up triggers to see if the format of your response changes, how the application processes that information differently. And that way you can have an extra layer of security that you don't have to use unless the worst happens. Management and pricing is another thing that a lot of developers asked us about. So what do you actually give us, right? Why would we use you? And this C++ developer has said a problem with the management is he said API calls require more bandwidth than others, and his server computing costs would be significantly higher for certain types of calls rather than others. So our original platform only had per-call API pricing, but we're also implementing bandwidth-based API pricing, because there are a lot of APIs when people run serverless where it'll be much more expensive on certain types of calls. So you can charge based on execution time rather than just per call. Documentation and best practice guidelines is another way that we're helping management. So we're forcing developers, API developers, to put on good documentation, right? And we're saying you have to fill these fields out. You have to fill out a certain amount of words in each one. And that guarantees that there will be some state of readable documentation for application developers to be able to build off. And finally, a unified authentication flow. APIs put on Codugh will all go through the same flow. And what that means is you can authenticate all your APIs one way. And you don't have to go through the hassle and headache of 10 different APIs on your application and having to authenticate each differently and having to figure out how each of them works. Integrations within the BSV ecosystem. So we've had a lot of conversations with BSV developers, and there's a few ways that we can better our product using the BSV ecosystem. BitPing can give us uptime statistics on APIs. So if you're an API developer and you think you want to advertise your uptime statistics, you can purchase the BitPing package. What that would mean is that your uptime is constantly reported, and people who access the marketplace can see your uptime right there posted. And that's another reliability metric that they can use to trust you. Loggeroo can give us immutable logging on the blockchain. So all of your API calls can be logged, and we can track analytics on that. We can track your success rate. We can track what types of calls fail, why they fail, and we can provide you analytics on that. And that's all immutably logged on chain. Now, Joshua Hensley, I think he's somewhere here, had a really good talk at Cambrian SV earlier this week about professionalizing Bitcoin services. And because of that, we've also decided to implement an SLA system where we facilitate SLAs between large application developers and API developers on our platform. And that will mean that application developers can have more trust if you're a large application developer when using the platform. So recently last week we built some great products with a great team at Cambrian SV. And now what's next for us? Well, we're growing volume and preparing to launch Codugh Alpha. And then we can do some testing there before we release it to the public. So our vision is to grow the BSV ecosystem and use BSV to provide economic opportunity to every developer in the world. So join us as we grow our waitlist and we launch Codugh Alpha. Thanks, guys.
Hello, it's Hannah Jackson here with Coingeek.com, and I'm here with Shashank Singhal from Codugh. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'm going to start by saying a big congratulations for winning the second virtual hackathon last year. So tell me a bit more about your company.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and thanks for that. So Codugh is basically an API marketplace that allows developers to post their APIs, and then application developers can come and consume their APIs, and they pay per call to consume the APIs. So it would be a microtransaction per call. One example of that could be a video converting API. So if someone's built an API that converts .wav files to .mp4 files, they can put that on Codugh. And then an application developer who's building something like a video editing software can come on and say, hey, I don't want to build this converting functionality myself. They can go into Codugh, grab the API, and bake that functionality into their application using the API. And then they can simply pay a few cents per call each time a user uses that functionality to convert a video.
Wow, okay. All right, well, coming from a past winner, for any budding and aspiring developers out there who might have their eyes on the third virtual hackathon, what kind of advice would you give to them?
Well, I think it's great to build good code, and it's great to be a good developer, but you've really got to focus on the business side. You've really got to make sure you're making a viable business that people will be able to sell and you'll be able to profit from.
Mm-hmm. There you go, advice, listen to him. Now, moving into the future then, what can you see in the next couple of years? Because obviously 2020 has been a really, really big year. So what's on the horizon for you?
Well, for Codugh, we plan to launch Codugh Alpha soon and begin testing. And then as soon as that's done, we hope to drive a lot of volume to the platform. And hopefully with the growth of BSV, a lot of traffic will come directly to the platform. And use BSV to empower developers around the world and create economic opportunity for developers everywhere.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.